Today we have on a wonderful guest, Michael Brussel. He's an architect from Syracuse,
Yes.
Syracuse, and a graduate of Virginia Tech. And today we have him on to talk about a whole host of things, including art, architecture, school, everything in between. So I'll let him take it away with a little bit about himself.
Okay. Thank you for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah. So I graduated from architecture school a few years ago, and working at an architecture firm now. But I'm also doing a lot of painting and pursuing some more artistic endeavors in my free time. But those are basically the two things that kind of uh, dominate you know my thoughts and my thought process, are just like these interests in architecture and in art.
Yeah, it's really cool. And so we kind of got in touch with you through your Instagram and your art practice and sort of the content that you're putting out in the world. So why don't you describe a little bit about like your thought process behind that, and maybe for the audience, a little bit about like what that content actually is.
And plug your Instagram.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my Instagram is my name, Michael Brussel. It's MCLBRSL, and I got the idea for the Instagram with in the beginning of my final semester of architecture school at Virginia Tech. And basically it was the result of this, kind of putting thinking about the future and what I'm going to do after I graduate. And what I realized is that I what I'm most interested in is representing myself. I don't really have a whole lot of interest representing, I want to always be me in professional settings. And so to begin to set up, am I too close to the mic? We good? Um, kind of in an effort to, also as this is kind of a jumping off point for like the beginning of my career as a creative person, as a designer. And we had this kind of um pivotal moment where before, I had done 4 years of undergraduate architecture school, and we're on the brink of um beginning or starting to think about our thesis, and COVID happened and everyone got sent home, and I was home. And one of the things that we were kind of instructed to do as we start, like about 6 months before we were going to get into our thesis is, you have to figure out what the heck you want to study for an entire year. And that's a super daunting thing. And one of the bits of advice that we got from one of our professors is to look back at all the projects that we had done so far and see if we could find some sort of like thread of continuity through each of our projects that kind of says something about what our interests are. Because a lot of times, like when you're doing an architecture assignment, you're not thinking about who you are or anything. You're just trying to like do your best to like answer the problem in a way that you think is interesting. But so like from when you're so close to the work, it's hard to actually see like maybe what your voice is that's coming through. But then when you look back at like 4 years of work, you start to notice some things. And so I went through that process like kind of during COVID a little bit while I was home, where I was like looking at not only like my projects, but also going back through like old notebooks, and kind of I remember I went through like all the notes from all the lectures I had been to, and I started highlighting like all the things that resonated with me. And then I put those into a Google Doc, and I started using that Google Doc of like condensed information that I was most interested in, to start to like maybe inform where my thesis was going to go. And I kind of like divided that information into a few categories. And so having gone through that experience of like looking back through all of my previous influences, I kind of, now that we fast forward to when I started the Instagram, is I kind of wanted to do the same sort of thing where I'm like, I'm bringing together all of the things that are influencing my growth as a designer. So not only like the projects that I'm working on, but the things that I'm reading, the places that I'm going, the sketches that I'm doing. And it's really important that I have documented everything chronologically so that I can begin to start to see maybe another thread of continuity, because the 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 things that I'm making now are always like kind of reinforming the previous events, and things that I've done, and vice versa. So it's kind of a way for, it's nice to like share with everyone else like the things that I've made and learned and done, because I really believe in some of the perspectives that I'm sharing. But it's also just really important for me to kind of see like, what the heck I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like whenever I guess like for me, my portfolio is kind of like what does that for me, like seeing what I've done in the past, I don't know, like 3 years of architecture school. I mean, it's part of it is like trying to apply for a job and you're like rushing to get that done. But I think doing like something like an Instagram is more for like yourself, I guess, and like you get more of like a more time to curate what you actually want and not trying to like impress. I don't know. Like, is your portfolio a lot different than what you put on your Instagram? I guess that's something I'm curious
That's a good.
about.
I've had a few versions of a portfolio that I've
Mm,
sent out as part of an application process, but actually I haven't even really reformatted a portfolio since I have a portfolio of my first 4 years of undergrad, which I did before my thesis started, and then I have my thesis documentation, but I haven't really done any, I guess, uh, architectural application worthy type of documentation. I'm kind of and that I guess that's probably a thing that I'll need if I apply to more architecture firms in the future. But I just thought that, the way trends are going, I want to basically also too. I didn't even have Instagram. Uh, I had it, when I was a kid and I was posting like stuff that was personal to me, and then around like 2019, I deleted it. And that was like right before COVID, and I was kind of like, I was like, what's the point? But then I realized like when you go to like events or you or networking or you go to like meet people or something, and basically you introduce yourself, and the thing that they'll try to like look at to see what this person's about is they'll look up your Instagram. So it's
mhm.
kind of like a trail of breadcrumbs that I was trying to leave as well.
I mean, I am always like pitching this to younger students and everything. It's like your Instagram is like your quickest portfolio.
Mm.
It's like the quickest way that, someone can gauge like who you are and what your work about. And I think like you do that in a really, really interesting way where it's um very true, I think, in a way. I don't know. I mean, what's your take on that maybe?
Yeah, no, I,
Yeah.
I definitely think it's a pretty free platform where you can, yeah, basically, I mean, when you look at someone else's Instagram, it's like this is how they are choosing to portray themselves. It's
Yeah.
such a great opportunity to do that. And I just like am kind of coming at it from like a pretty um obsessive mindset where it's like how much control can I take over this um, software, this app that does have a fair amount of limitations, and I'm kind of trying to see how much I can like push against those,
Yeah.
and make it as like personalized and customized as I possibly can.
Yeah. I mean, I know when we spoke earlier, you were kind of talking about how like your your work doesn't quite get fed through the algorithm because you're kind of
Mm.
breaking that mold, but um it's kind of interesting. It's his own challenge in a way that there's a perceived right and wrong way to do Instagram, but
Yeah, no, that I definitely. The problem with the algorithm is that the way that it works basically is that it shows people it basically assumes what you already like based on the things that you have already liked. So what it's going to do is if it's only showing you and feeding you content that's similar to content that you've already liked, then if someone makes something that's totally new or has never been seen before, the algorithm doesn't know what to do with that, and so it's not going to push it. And what that's going to result in is us having feeds that are just recycling and regurgitating the same stuff over and over and over. We're not going to see anything. I mean, it's like this kind of it's created this maybe this gray area where it's like you have to, and this is probably an important thing in architecture too, where you have to like design in a way that's like familiar enough that people kind of do recognize some part of it, but then has like a just enough of a twist of something new to, agree with the algorithm or to be visually pleasing enough to exist and maybe be built or something, but then also inspire something new.
Yeah. I mean,
I guess something you also talked about was how, you have a very unique way to that your art is laid out on your Instagram, I guess, and that's something that also messes with the algorithm, like the posting
Oh
like the
yeah,
art on separate,
everything is cropped. Yeah.
right? But that's like interesting because maybe there's an opportunity to widen the way Instagram works. And I don't know. I always find myself having trouble cropping my things the way I want it because Instagram auto crops your
yeah.
stuff and it's messy. I don't know. Like,
Yeah. One thing, this actually, the idea for the cropping came from a first year assignment that I had in architecture school, where we were just doing these um, compositions of lines just in black and white, and it's kind of like this whole like thing where it's like you try to show how creative you are or whatever artistic you are through just this very simple thing of laying out a bunch of black and white lines. And one thing that once everyone we had to do like 10 of them or something, whatever, we pinned them all up on the wall, they looked super cool. And then that was maybe like it took like a week to do those or something. It was a week-long assignment. And then after that, the next week's assignment was we were given a set of crop marks. We had like just two pieces of like white paper to that we could kind of like, they're both L shaped, so you can kind of shimmy them around to try to like, and what the goal was to take what was already existing with the work that we'd already done and zoom in or reframe it to find proportions that were more pleasing. And I found that was like, I think it's harder to make the thing first than it is to find the beautiful thing within the thing after you've made it. And so, like, a hard thing to get over, I think, when you've done this project is, I think any drawing or building that you've done, it's difficult to get over the totality of it because you're proud of the totality of it. But I think if you can get over that and you can get a set of crop marks and you can just narrow in and focus in on like the most beautiful part, I find so much in my own work that's just way more satisfying because it's like you didn't intend to make it and you could have never intended to make it, but you have a good enough eye to see it. And so on my Instagram feed, even with my paintings, I'm not even like showing any respect for the totality of the paintings that I've created. I'm still cropping them and leaving stuff out because I think there's something more intriguing when you don't really tell the whole story with an image.
It's kind of like a hook.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think there's any architecture that works that way where it's like that like actually pays respect to the crop in a way?
100%. I'm trying to remember. I think David Leatherborough writes about. I'm trying to remember. There's like this architectural concept that I can't remember the name of, but basically it's this whole thing where there are some buildings, the way that they're like, we were talking about this earlier about the architecture buildings, like at Virginia Tech's architecture building, it's laid out in such a symmetrical, rigid order where if you've been on one of the floors, you can kind of like assume, you can kind of picture the whole building in your head after just seeing one or two floors because of its repetitive layout. And then there are other buildings where this is definitely a David Leatherborough writing, and he talks about like some building in Seattle where it's like there's a constant unfolding of your understanding of the architecture as you experience it space by space. It's not an architecture that can be understood in its totality from a single location. So you kind of like create the picture in your head through a procession, through like a series of images that you collect.
That's interesting. Yeah.
That's cool.
I think it's intriguing because there's this other in the book 101 Things I've Learned in Architecture School by Matthew Frederick. I don't know if you guys have.
Yeah.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
it's probably the best architecture book. It's one of the best. And there's this one note that he has in there that I've kind of been obsessed with, and it pretty much shows up in all of my projects that I've ever done. And it really yeah, it's one of like the threads of continuity that I was talking about earlier. And it's called denial and reward.
Denial.
And what it is basically from one vantage point in space, you can see maybe another place within the area that you're, the building that you're in. You can see like another path or another hallway or another room, on the other side of the atrium or something. And you see people walking over there, but the path to get there isn't evident. It's almost like you have to go and follow a path that takes the destination out of view before you get to the destination. And that small moment adds like intrigue. It almost makes the architecture a sort of playground. There's another, I think David Leatherbow actually has a quote about like the foot should not travel the same path as the eye.
That's
Yeah.
cute.
Yeah, and I'm kind of like obsessed with that. I haven't thought about how that would play into my paintings, but I like the spatial concept.
That's very interesting. I did a project last year, which was kind of in that similar vein. It's actually about these curtains, basically in like this pavilion setting where it's basically using these like sort of translucent fabric curtains and then vegetation curtains to create these like vignettes around like these ponds. Basically, it's all kind of like abstracted into orthogonal forms and like and everything, but like it was sort of this it was on Roosevelt Island. It was sort of this threshold experience between like the rest of the island, the Louis Kahn FDR Memorial. The idea was basically that like from one end, and with these dynamic curtains, it's like in this depended on like kind of the settings of it or how it was organized, but you could see through it, but you could, because these curtains were translucent, but you couldn't actually. Right. You had to like sneak. There was like this idea of like sneaking past the curtain and sort of taking these like or taking the wrong path basically. Yeah. To find your way through and kind of finding these vignettes yourself or making these vignettes yourself as well. There was never like one constant, which I thought was like a really cool proposition. But
now, were you framing like particular views with those curtains? Was there a sort of perspective that you were trying to get at?
It was almost like this like room without a house concept where these curtains were like creating these different spaces around like these what I was calling points of attraction. They were basically these vegetation curtains hanging over these ponds. But the way in which the pond and the curtain was framed was different. By how the curtains were kind of contracted and expanded or shifted around the project.
I guess the reason what I'm trying to get at, one thing that I think is that really interests me is the way of designing architecture, I guess, because I think there's like two ways. There's two ways that I'm going to categorize it into. And one of the ways is designing through the floor plan with kind of like an ordered grid, or maybe like kind of like more of like a mathematical alignment type of understanding of the layout and kind of like choreographing of different scenes. And it's a very, I don't want to, basically the story is told through the plan. And there's some skepticism with that because we don't experience architecture in 2 dimensions. Like from a bird's eye point of view, we experience it in 3 dimensions. And so the other category of designing architecture is 3-dimensionally, is setting up an arrangement of spaces and a set of like perspectives and views and images as someone in three-dimensional space. Maybe it's like through model making or something. And that to me, that's always been, and it's kind of like a loose, it's not really, there's no mathematical way to really set up those perspectives. It's something that you have to actually like be there and figure out like instance by instance. And I think the reason why I haven't really approached architecture in that way is because it goes against a lot of things that I think like the actual structure and materials want to do, or has the potential to do that. If you're just kind of like adding in weird angles just to like have a certain view of something.
Yeah.
That's not really like my approach. I like to kind of maintain some sort of like material integrity, but I definitely think it's like a valid way, another appropriate way to like try to lay out space.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people I've talked to go back and forth between like the plan drawing and then you build it and then you see what's wrong with it and then you fix it, and it's kind of like this process of going back and forth between 2D and 3D. And I mean, like even the way professors teach class kind of facilitates that. I think at least at Pratt, because they always ask for plans and then the next week it's like sections and model, and it's like back and forth.
Yeah.
So I feel like there are certain things you can do in plan that you can't figure out in 3D, I guess, like the structural grid, that kind of order and that kind of thing. But I think it's worth doing both.
This semester I've actually been designing in plan a lot, which is interesting for like how sectional this specific
Right.
project is, but it's kind of been interesting to sort of do it that way. And I mean, for context, we're doing like this very vertical audiovisual addition to a library. It's very sectional. I mean,
That section you were showing us earlier, right?
yeah, but most of that was actually designed in plan, which I don't know. It's just like a weird.
I always find plans like less daunting. Like I can design and plan like first go and then go back and
Yeah.
try to think about what views I can get.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think what I've always found to be comforting about the plan is actually, now that I think about it, it's probably the least architectural drawing. It's the most like artistic, and I can kind of like I can go after a pretty image easier.
Right.
Because once I put it into section, I have to like, I'm stuck with the proportions of like ceiling heights and stairs.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more limits that I have to fight, but in plan, I'm free.
It's true.
That is true.
Yeah.
And I also like the fact that you can see like below and above at the same time in plan, which I like.
Yeah.
You have the
Into
spatial
voids.
awareness even though it's flat.
Yeah. It's kind of, I mean, it's interesting, kind of. I don't know, like, we were sort of talking about this on the way over to record, but like, you were talking interestingly, like how you kind of get to choose what you represent and how you represent it. And I think like for us that differs because it's very rigid in like what we represent and how we represent it. But like, I mean, I guess I had this question as we were walking over, but like, what were you representing? Like, what was your kind of aim throughout your projects to represent, other than like maybe the nitty gritty, the plans, the sections?
That's a good question. I guess the breakthrough that I kind of made, the thing that I really started to get interested in, was in my 5th year thesis project. I was trying to create an architecture that I could prove through the use of geometry and math and like compass constructions. I was trying to create basically like justified architecture where every decision had a justification, and I wanted this justified architecture to, the aim of it was to exist in harmony with nature. And I'm after an architecture that is profound. I think that's probably the ultimate aim, is to create spaces that are profound. And just in day-to-day life and experience, for me, I most often encounter things that are profound out in nature. It's things that are naturally occurring. And I think another maybe more specific word for profound for me is sublime. And I've been thinking about this lately. The two things that we encounter the most often that I think that deal with the sublime are bodies of water and clouds. I was driving home the other day and I looked up in the sky and there was like this massive cloud. And I was like, that is probably the biggest singular object that I have seen all day. And the size of me in proportion to the size of that cloud, just makes me feel small. That's the sublime, is this like kind of overwhelming feeling that you get when you see something that's almost like so big that you can't comprehend. And as I was on the train to New York the other day, it's so interesting how like a lot of beautiful things pass by when you're on the train. You see houses, you see trees, whatever, this and that. But the thing that makes people look up from their phone is when you go by a body of water. And I was like, what is it about that? And I think it's the sublime. It's like all of that stuff is making one thing. It's a oneness. It's one body of water, but it's so big. It's the biggest thing that I've seen today. And so that's what I'm after in architecture, is this kind of feeling of like infinity, or something that's profound, or something that's beyond, I don't know, almost like incomprehensible. And the bridge that we have as designers, one thing that a lot of like mathematicians have tried to do is to find like an underlying mathematical order in naturally occurring things,
like the golden ratio.
Exactly. The golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence. And I think those, somewhere within those, is like the key to like the order of the universe. The way that those things are designed. I mean, we didn't, God or whatever, like designed those. And like, I want to like design buildings that are kind of like structured or ordered the same way as those like, and the things like that I think of that are beautiful, that are, can be broken down mathematically, are things like flowers, seashells, trees. If you're like swimming in the ocean or something, and you go underwater and you look at like the sand and like
the ripples,
the ripples in the sand, I think that's so amazing. And if I can understand that underlying mathematical order and then create architecture that has that same order, it's super rigid and mathematical, but I think that like, and I impose that like on the plan. The plan is what obeys that, and I used compass constructions to do that. It's kind of like this new, circles are the key to everything too. It's like when I found out that you can draw a bunch of circles to create a square, that blew my mind, and I immediately became obsessed. And so somewhere in there, in like using geometry and all these circles to create rooms and order spaces, I think there's a way to, in a very pragmatic way, arrange space in a way that leads to a profound arrangement of spaces, or like profound moments. So I've kind of, the plan for me has been where I have used the key to try to get to spaces that are profound.
I mean, I think like the notion of like a profound space is interesting. It's because it's like, you're right. It's like you can't put a finger on what makes something so attractive or profound. It just kind of is. Yeah, I mean,
and you can't like you can't really like manifest it intentionally. It's not something where it's like, okay, and when you round this corner, you're gonna like have this profound experience. Like you can't, it doesn't work like that. It's kind of like, it's the same thing with like the cropping that we were talking about earlier. It's like, it's not something that is created intentionally. It is something that is discovered.
Yeah.
And so I want to like have an ordering system, or like a process that has a tendency to create spaces that are enjoyable to discover.
Yeah.
That's the rabbit hole that I fell down for a year
Thesis.
during my thesis.
I
Yeah.
kind of I want to see this thesis document.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
So if you look on my Instagram right now, I've started to. There's been a series of projects that I've already documented that are from this thesis. So it began with the spirit architecture. If you go back and basically with that exercise is kind of where I discovered we had this assignment where it's like it wasn't even to design a building. It was just design a thing. and the thing should be the essence of spirit. And that's so like loose, right? There's no, and so I remember my classmates were doing like, little models with like string or these things that like, the thing about a model is in architecture school, you're always designing a model at scale, right? It's never like 1-to-1. It's always some sort of other proportion. And if you don't have a little scale marker next to it, which nobody ever does, the only things that you have for scale are like maybe like thresholds or stairs or something where like you can look and be like, okay, I kind of understand the proportions of this model. Stairs are a good indicator of that. But if you don't have that, and you don't have any architectural elements, you don't have a column, you don't have a threshold, you don't have a window, then the model that you've made could really, how do I know what size it is? And so people were, and my classmates were making models that didn't have any architectural elements. And I guess I'm just realizing this now, but like I felt like, okay, if I'm gonna like evoke the essence of spirit, I wanted to it's got to be like an inhabitable space. And if I'm going to communicate an inhabitable space, then it's going to have architectural elements. And then the question becomes, how do you arrange architectural elements in a way that is not arbitrary? This was my opportunity to take a prompt that was completely arbitrary or not very directive and impose a whole other set of limits that create an end product that has zero arbitrary decisions. That's kind of like my whole thing as an artist too. I'm just I can't stand arbitrary decisions. And so what I did with this spirit, this building of the essence of spirit is I started bringing in quotes and all these influences from numerology. So like symbolic meaning of numbers, theology, different religious sayings and symbolism, and probably some phenomenological stuff too. But numerology was the big one, and there's 3 numbers that I brought in: number 2, 3, and 9, which each had their own. I could get into it deeper, but I'm kind of. Anyways, we're just talking about the documentation that I have of my thesis, and so that's kind of that project is where my thesis kind of was born. And then after that, I did a set of like when I actually like got to, because that was like a pre-studio assignment that I did over the summer before thesis started. And then once thesis actually started, I realized that I had all these different interests in all these different like fields, like I was just naming, like philosophy, theology, numerology, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, and I saw all these like, similarities and kind of like overlapping topics, but I didn't really know how they all like could come together to help me, to be like kind of my foundation for the thesis here. And so the first project that I did, which is on the Instagram, is just kind of like a thought mapping is what I called it, building the foundation and kind of pulling in all of these different ideas, kind of just like in a brain vomit sort of way on a page, and then kind of trying to see like the thread of continuity and see how the things relate. So that's on there. I did, and my next post is going to be about the overall structure of the thesis, which is basically there's 3 projects that the thesis goes through, and each project focuses on being an architectural representation of a number and all of the symbolism behind that number. So I do number 1, number 2, and number 3. But there's also a couple of trajectories that that kind of art go through the projects. One of them being like this movement of the projects from the universal to the specific, or from the I'm kind of like the project development number one, which I already posted, is very broad, and then I'm getting in every sense, in material sense, in the site, every aspect is kind of the same sort of um has the same kind of like looseness and unspecificity. And then as I go from project to project, as I approach project number three, it becomes very like specific to material and place and time and all these other like aspects. So that's coming. It'll be posted soon. I've been a little bit too excited about the paintings and stuff recently to still be putting a lot of time into documenting a project that I did 2 years ago now.
Right.
But it's on the way, so you'll be able to see it soon.
We'll be on the lookout.
I mean, thesis here, and then now you're in an architectural office, and how's that going for you?
It's good. The office I work at is awesome, and I think that but it's funny how like the way that I look at it now. I guess when I graduated architecture school, I had this dream of being, having my own architecture firm. And what I've realized over the last couple of years is that I've just kind of become more aware of like the actual process of like designing a building, and it's amazing like the amount of time and people and decisions that come between the initial conception of the project and the end result. And what I'm noticing is that it's really almost a miracle that anything like amazing ever gets built. And you could have like, and this is not from my own experience, but just like there's so many hoops that a great idea has to pass through to be executed. In terms of like, there's so many things pushing back on the idea, I guess, in architecture, being, your project team, the client, the budget, material capabilities, building codes. And so your idea has to be in agreement with all of these things. And that's not even including like problems that might come up on the site or something once you start building. And getting past each of those things, or having the idea maintain its potency as it passes through each hoop, I think requires compromise or potential like an explaining of and I don't want to say arguing, I'm trying not to say arguing, but like an explaining of the idea. And that's something that I realized I'm just not interested in. I don't want to have to fight for my ideas, because I'm not even like, how confident can you even be in an idea really until you've, gone through a couple of the hoops with it, or I don't know. There's just a lack of control, I guess, that I've become aware of in the short 2 years that I've had in the architecture world. And so it's that lack of control that led me back to, it's one of the things that led me back to painting. Because in that world, there is no arguing. There's no trying to convince anyone of my ideas except for myself. And there's nothing stopping me. It's just me and the canvas and the materials, and I can kind of push any idea as far as I want. And then when I don't want to deal with it anymore, I don't have to. And that's a kind of control that I've really enjoyed. It's been a great outlet for me, but there's still I have a lot of my best ideas for painting when I'm doing architecture work, or when I'm in the office and I'm interacting with people and having conversations and just observing the world, I guess, is where I get my inspiration. So they work in tandem.
Oh yeah. I mean, I feel like as third years, me and Aryan, we've probably felt some semblance of that, even though we haven't really gotten into it yet. Like through pro practice and like building services and all that kind of stuff, we've sort of been told like, oh, you can't do this or you really can't do that because it doesn't work in real life. And like, I mean, like it's tough in the moment, but like something my professor told me was like, you're basically just a detective trying to figure out what the best building is for this site and for this client and for this program.
I disagree with that.
How so? I would like to know.
There are so many aspects of a building that need to be designed for you to get to the totality of a building.
Right.
And I think that one of the big misconceptions with architecture school is aiming for totality, because you only have a couple months, you only have a month, you only have a couple weeks to do this project.
Right.
And so what I learned how to do over the course of 5 years and would probably still be improving upon is I just, one of my biggest regrets is doing any bathroom layouts. Like, do not, if you're laying out a bathroom and trying to decide where toilets and sinks go in architecture school, you're wasting your time immediately. What you need to do, the way that you need to approach each project is that basically what architecture is an arrangement of architectural elements. What you're studying in each project is the relationship of architectural elements. And you have an opportunity with each project to test different relationships and maybe try to get at something that like hasn't been, you're in the beginning, you're just trying to figure out what you're interested in. What, do you like thresholds? Do you like windows? Do you like columns and the different aspects that go around designing one of those things? But you can just zoom in so far to any particular aspect that basically the way you need to address an architectural assignment is by narrowing it down to a few architectural elements that you want to study the relationships between, and only designing things that are going to help you answer the architectural question that you want to answer. If materiality, like if you're just focusing on proportions of a room or, ceiling heights, windows, or like some sort of like procession through a building, then you don't need to worry about designing what the building is made of. It doesn't matter. It's not relevant to the architectural question that you're asking. And it definitely doesn't matter where the bathrooms are, how far apart the toilets are. So I wasted a lot of time in the beginning just designing parts of the building that were not relevant to the architectural questions that I was trying to answer. There are really important topics in architecture that you can address or expand upon or learn about through a project. And we spend a lot of time not doing that when we're, designing things that are just not related to, like if you're detailing like a handrail or something, I'm pretty sure that handrail detail is probably not going to help you answer the architectural question that you're after. So I think a lot of, and I don't know if your professors are like steering you in these ways too, because there is like a sexiness about like the totality of a building. I designed a whole building and I rendered it, and there's couches and there's plants and there's all this, and there's people walking through it. And it's just, if you were to, and this is again about my whole like thing against like arbitrary decisions. It's like, if you were to get rid of that couch, or if you were to get rid of the material, would it still be the building that you're after? It's like this whole stripping down to the essence of the thing. And there's a painter that has a quote about how the thing is the thing. It is the most beautiful when you have taken away the most things that you can take away without it losing its thingness. It's still the thing. It's barest bones. That is when you've made something that is pure and beautiful. It's just so easy to run out of time in architecture school. There's just never enough time. There's never enough time.
That is true.
That is true.
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah.
Right? I know I'm stressing you guys out. You're like super close to the semester.
Yeah.
I know, but maybe that will help me, because right now I think third years do have a tendency to try try to go for that totality because we're trying to, it's like our integrated semester, and like you're supposed to make a building that supposedly works in real life, and so then you have to like go in and design all these tiny things that are like the egress, whatever, like that has to work, the code, whatever has to work. But I mean, like at a certain point, what is more interesting is perhaps like the architectural elements, the relationship that you're trying to explore. And I like, that's what I find myself trying to do right now. Like my professor was having us designing all these little details for like the past 4 weeks, and all I really wanted to focus on was my corridor, and I was like so frustrated. But
yeah, that might have been like where something really interesting,
right,
would have came from,
yeah,
was
and
that
he was
corridor.
like, work on this facade, and I was like, no, I
That's the
don't
thing
want
too.
to.
Yeah, like there's the appeal to design a facade.
I hate designing facades.
You know,
Amen.
There's not a
Amen.
whole lot of architectural questions in the facade. I don't know if there's a lot of architects even still that don't design. Like Luke Khan, I wasn't really after facade. You know, the facade was kind of more a consequence of the material connections. So yeah, I probably spent too much time, you know, designing facades a couple times in school because it is, you know, an attractive thing to do.
Right.
It's
And professors push it.
Yeah,
because they want to know what
Yeah.
It's like it's easier to understand what the building is when you see a facade in some senses,
right,
because it has like a facade has a certain attitude, but it's not a way all the time to get after like an architect. Morphosis is another great example of like they don't design facades. Frank Gehry doesn't design facades. They design, you know, they have a process that leads to like an image or a building or whatever. But yeah, start with an architectural question is I think the best advice I can give for time management in architecture school.
And crop stuff.
Yeah.
Yes.
And bring your crop marks.
Yeah. Crop marks. I'll use that for my presentation.
Yeah. Well, should we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any last things you would like to say?
I don't think so. If you guys want to see more, follow me on Instagram.
Oh yeah.
MCLBRSL. And if you didn't see something that you liked today, you're going to see something totally different tomorrow. So stick with it. There's a lot of different content on there.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful time in Brooklyn and New York, and
have fun at this art gala.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Thank you so much
for coming.
I'm Eshaan.
I'm Saori.
And this has been the Pratt Futures podcast.
Featuring Aryan.
Aryan's doing tech today. He's
nice.